When we talk about Chinese culture, we seldom talk about games. Well, in the meantime, for example, Black Miss Wukong actually opens a gateway for foreign players to get to know the new China. I'm Felania Mengfei Liu. I'm a game scholar in Beijing Normal University and also the curator for Homo Ludens Archive, the place that we shoot this. It's more difficult for normal Chinese people to accept it as sort of a cultural norm because the Confucius idea that we were educated with actually believes that adult gamers and 君子, they don't play. That's been written in the 24th histories. It was one of the research that I did in 2010. The gamers that we found in those 24th histories are either EU magistrates or they are very bad rulers, servants, slaves, concubines. So none of them are 君子. None of them are the mainstream, major literati that rules the society. Also back then, I also realized that in the Confucius state, when a 君子 cultivates himself, he cultivates himself through the 6 arts. For example, archery and horse riding are both games. Even writing poetry is a type of game. If you take a deeper look at it, you would find that actually Confucius literati cultivate themselves through games, but they don't recognize themselves as gamers, and they don't recognize games at all. It was actually one of the cultural attitude or cultural bias that we had. Actually, everyone is affected by gaming in a digital society. And of course, our life is actually controlled by gamified softwares. For example, Alipay use gamification. And of course, Meituan and also Didi, the delivery drivers, that they were also controlled and guided by the gamified system. It's very easy to see people being played by those softwares and being played by those gamification management systems instead of being an independent player. And so that's also why we figure that it's very essential that for the modern society to grow to have this broadened idea of game literacy that includes everyone. So we define it as a sort of critical thinking of games and also to utilize games for your daily work or life. And I did have this idea that game from the very beginning is an educational tool. I started to play video games since the age of 4. My father introduced the game produced by a Japanese company called the Tank War to me. My father was using that as an educational tool to teach a 4-year-old how to make military maneuvers in a professional way. It's actually a very entertaining and meaningful, but in the meantime, educational setting where you can play with others.
What kind of role do you think teachers should play in building us towards a high gaming literacy community?
That's a perfect question. That's actually the question that I was hoping journalists would ask for the past 10 years. In the past, people do not think of teachers as part of the game ecosystem, and they don't think of them when we talk about game literacy. But they are the one that we should mostly value because they are the ones who actually teach the next generation of students of the aesthetics of all sorts of cultural expressions. I realized 2 years ago that game never enters any sort of schooling system in Chinese society. So the teachers just don't talk about it and they pretend it doesn't exist. Well, in the meantime, they would protest to stop the game industry in the national gathering. And even our archive received this one letter from a secondary school teacher, and that letter is consisted of 6 pages written by hand. And he was basically saying that he wanted us to say to the higher 领导 that we should stop the game industry because they were affecting the next generation in a really strong way, while he said that we cannot control it. What really matters is that if we can give the teachers a toolbox to make use of game instead of alienating them from the player base, then it should be more useful and more ecologically friendly for the whole ecosystem to grow. While we were giving game literacy lessons to the younger generation, we always encourage them to explore and to experience various types of games on various platforms. We encourage them to be reflective on what type of players they are and how long have they been playing games in their life and what functions has game played in their life. I mean, that's the correct way to let the player experience and then upgrade to a higher level, and then they decide on their own. What I really value is that a high game literacy society should be able to utilize games for their social good. For example, parents would really care about how their children play and whether games can be a way to cultivate their children's education in the long run. And on the basis of that, I think it really matters to them to separate between the loot box game and consumer game and the craft game. And so the craft game are those type of game that we normally call the payoff game, where you only need to pay once and then you would get the full pack. Also, board games are actually craft games, that if you choose games for your children's education or for students' education, then craft game is something that you definitely need to use. In the meantime, the majority of games that we encounter with are the other type of game. I call it consumer game or consumption game because it's actually a consumption system. What really matters is not the content. For example, 王者荣耀, it's one of the best consumer game we ever have. That's also the type of driving force for the Chinese game industry. I think if we think about Chinese games, sometimes we don't differentiate. For example, we would talk about Genshin Impact and their cultural impact. And to me, that's a bit funny. And of course, it's very well manufactured and it's very well advertised, but it's not a cultural artifact because it's at its best a consumer game and at its worst a loot box game. And European Union has pronounced that in 2018 they had released this regulation that any game with a loot box that can transfer real money into in-game currency is deemed as gambling. Of course, loot box game is a crucial part of the ecology that the Chinese game industry is developing. I always think of that as a sort of real social problem for parents and also for educators. I don't encourage teenagers to do that because sometimes they just don't realize it's gambling. Rating system. That's another very difficult question because in the past few years, at least 2 major national health agencies have tried to have our own classification of game systems. But the end result is not very ideal. Currently, we only have the age system, a recommendation system for people under 18 years old. And in other words, for teenagers. I was told that it's impossible to have the game classification system because the film industry also doesn't have it. The real scenario is very difficult, and so we cannot do that. Age differentiation system actually is something that the game industry actually wants because at least 95% of the Chinese game industry's income comes from adults, not youngsters. And so they want to differentiate so that they would have a greater room for artistic expression.